Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
You know, I like to start each episode by asking you guys if you've listened to anything interesting lately, and I want to jump right in at the top here because Dan's got a little field trip to tell us about. King Crimson, I think everybody knows, just came to streaming. Maybe I shouldn't say too much about it. I think we were kind of considering maybe doing an episode about it sometime in the future, but it's a major blunder for me. Something that I've just something about like their whole aesthetic with like the medieval knights and astrology and shit like is so off-putting to me, and they're like really obsessive fans. I don't know, but I'm learning this week that I was mistaken, I think, because I'm really falling under its spell. Did you say you're having kind of a similar experience, Dan?
Yeah, I have been. I've been listening for the same reason since it's on streaming. And we talked about Red on the old podcast, and I think I shit on it. But luckily, I don't think it's online anymore, so I can pretend I didn't. Because I've been enjoying that record and Starless and Bible Black. Getting into it. I'm a prog guy now.
What about you, Darren?
I've been listening to pretty much Bob Dylan, which is what we're discussing today, right?
Yeah. All right. So, Dan, what field trip are you telling us about?
Yeah, I saw. I went to two concerts actually. I saw Earth at the Will's Pub in Orlando, which is a like really tiny place. There really weren't like a ton of people there. Like a lot of people left after the opening band, who I had never heard of. But you know, they were great. Played a lot of stuff from the new record. You know, Earth. You kind of know what you're getting into. But it was great.
Is it just like guitar and drums live as well?
No, they had a second guitarist too, who was like some young guy that I didn't recognize. But in the past when I've seen them, they had like a keyboardist one time. I think they sort of Dylan and the drummer are sort of the only standard members, I guess. But then also, my wife and we took a little mini vacation to Athens, Georgia, and we saw Sleep at the 40 Watt, a very famous club, REM, and everybody got their start at. And that was great. You know, they're this is the second time I've seen them, and they're just like a really good live band. You know, they played a bunch of stuff from the newest record, a couple things from Holy Mountain, just loud and doomy. It was pretty great.
Yeah, there's a lot of drone in your life recently.
Yeah, I know. I'm seeing Boris in a couple weeks, too.
Oh, wow.
I know. No ears left.
Just gotta catch sun, and it's like the whole genre.
I know.
Basically.
Seen them all.
All right. Well, let's get into today's topic then. In the past couple weeks, I'm sure everybody knows, Bob Dylan's famed 1975 concert tour, the Rolling Thunder Revue, has been documented in film by Netflix's Rolling Thunder Revue, a Bob Dylan story by Martin Scorsese. By Martin Scorsese, by the way, as well as a new 14-disc box set called the Rolling Thunder Revue, the 1975 live recordings. Like a lot of people then, we've been completely captivated by this fascinating chapter in Dylan's long, strange career. Early in the documentary, Dylan says he doesn't remember anything about the tour because it happened so long ago he wasn't even born. I really love that. And he admits that he can't get to the core of what it was all about because, quote, it's about nothing. So for today's episode, we're going to dive deep into both the film and the box set to see if we can do a better job of answering that question. What was this Rolling Thunder Revue all about? First, I want to know everybody's approach to this set film. How would you describe your level of Dylan fandom, and what did you know about this era, the Rolling Thunder Revue in particular, going in?
Well, my level of Dylan fandom, huge fan. He's without a doubt my favorite artist. I know more than I wish I did about not only him but the Rolling Thunder Revue. I've read countless books. I feel like I know a lot.
I'm a big Bob Dylan fan. Musically, he's just kind of an obvious pillar. Alongside like something like the Beatles. You know what I mean? I've always been a fan. Obviously, all of the '60s records, pretty much like love all of those. And Blood on the Tracks, Desire, and I kind of stop pretty much there. I don't really go
missing out
beyond all of that. Seems just like a very dark space to go into. What about you, Gabe?
Yeah, and there have been several points in my life where Dylan is my favorite artist, and it always seems like just every couple of years I get into a big phase, and I guess like a lot of people, I lean really heavily in the 60s stuff, which I think is obviously some of the best music ever made. The Basement Tapes are like in my top 5 albums, quote unquote, if you want to call it that, of all time. The 70s is a little bit of a mystery to me. It's like I've heard of these things like the Rolling Thunder Revue, but never really explored any of it. And obviously listen to Blood on the Tracks, Desire, but it feels like every time I get into a Dylan phase, I reach like one new album, like I get into like really heavy into New Morning, and I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize this was so good, or like, just something like that. And so it's weird because his later career, it feels like a mystery to me. I've just like dived in little points, but once this was announced, I was really, really excited to finally learn what it was all about, because I knew it was a big deal, but I guess that's all I knew. So on that note, I want to kind of, in a discussion form, get to all of this background info that I think is really relevant to this discussion. Dan, as the resident Dylan expert, can probably speak a lot to this, but from my understanding, it seems like Dylan is kind of going in a commercial and, maybe you're going to try to fight me on this, but even an artistic slump in the early 70s a little bit. And he has this kind of comeback with this tour with the band in 1974, Bob Dylan and the band, right? And from what I understand, Dan, it's like a huge stadium kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's like giant, many thousand people, arena shows. Because not only was Dylan, this is his first, he's played a couple like really tiny things since '66, the Judas tour or whatever. He played the concert for Bangladesh with George Harrison. He did the Isle of Wight festival, and he randomly showed up at this one folk festival under a secret name. It's so secret, there's literally only one picture that exists of it. But that's essentially all he did live from 66 until 74. So, it was a huge deal. They had lotteries to get the tickets. I can't remember I should have re-looked it up, but they in the paper, this is obviously before the internet and stuff. They it would have a lottery in the paper. You would write in, and if you got chosen, you could buy tickets. And they had something it was over 1 million people requested tickets. I want to say it's 3 million or something. It's many times over what tickets existed for this tour. Because you got to remember, the band had also become a huge band in their own right by 74 as well.
So it was just totally sold out the entire tour?
Yeah, it's crazy sold out, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a friend who's really into Fish, and they do this lottery thing, and it's he gets people, he pays people to enter multiple times, every time they go on tour, and it's sometimes he doesn't, him and nobody he knows wins at all, and then sometimes he wins 40 tickets and he has to sell the one thing. It's crazy. But anyway, so after this sort of comeback, highly publicized, like you said, this kind of amazing thing happens where 1975 and I guess into January 1976 is this magnificent return to form. We get Blood on the Tracks early in 75. We get the Rolling Thunder Revue, which we're going to talk about today in the latter half of 75. Of course, it continues on, but we'll talk about that later. And we get Desire, which is what, Dan? It's recorded before but released after this tour?
Yeah, most of it is recorded right before the tour. Hurricane was re-recorded I think 5 days before the tour started, because he had to change some of the lyrics so he wouldn't get sued.
Yeah, so it's this is something I want to keep turning to. This is one of the things that got me really interested in this set, because I know it falls right in the middle of this period. Darren, did you have any going into this, any ideas about based on your own Dylan fandom that you talked about, why is 75 this? Is it just a miracle or something that he pulls this off after kind of a slump and then immediately entering another very long slump?
Yeah, it's really strange because, I think the majority of my fandom was spent in the 60s albums. and that it kind of stops with like, Blonde on Blonde, obviously I feel like is probably my favorite Dylan record. And then, Nashville Skyline was like very different, although I did get into that. And then I just didn't really know much other than like, I kind of always thought like Self-Portrait was like the end, like for a long time. And then I don't know how I came to No Desire, maybe like Hurricane, I heard it, and that's sort of what got me into that. And then I went backwards to Blood on the Tracks. But like I had kind of lost any idea of like what was really going on with Dylan between like 69 and like this era.
Yeah, to me, that's like the biggest mystery that I want to keep touching on today, which is like, what is going on? And I think the Rolling Thunder Tour, I mean, in a literal sense, but also in sort of an artistic sense, is right at the center of this whole little Renaissance thing that goes on. So to get to the Rolling Thunder Revue, let's try to describe what it was. So I should mention, by the way, that Darren, by design, did not watch the film, okay, where he's sort of judging on a music-based sense. But Dan and I are pretty well-versed in the film and the box set, obviously. So, Dan, why don't you start? How would you describe to somebody who has no idea what it is? What is the Rolling Thunder Revue?
Yeah, it's basically, it's a review in the traditional sense. It's like a circus. He wanted it to be like a circus coming to town. Him and this the band he puts together goes by the name Guam. Is Joan Baez, Roger McGuinn, Mark Ronson, all these huge names.
Mick Ronson. I keep making that same mistake myself. There's a new pop star called Mark Ronson, apparently, but Mick Ronson is the correct Ronson.
Yeah. So he wanted to basically like get them all in a bus or whatever and travel from town to town. And like in the towns, if Joni Mitchell lived there, she would join the band for a night or in her case, join the rest of the tour. And, they were going to go from town to town and do that. And they did. So it was one huge show. The box set is only the Dylan sets. Right. But like the show would be like 4 to 5 hours long, depending on the night, and everyone would kind of take their turn in the spotlight, and then finally Dylan was the big headliner, or whatever, So Bob Newirth would play a few songs, Ginsberg would read some poetry, Baez would do a set, McGuinn would do some songs, and it was just this loose, like very circus thing in very small venues. 1,000 seaters, 1,500 seaters, compared to this giant, stadium tour the year before. So like they wouldn't even announce where they were going the next day. They would come into town, hand out flyers to people, and if you got in, you got in. It was this very like loose, freewheeling kind of kind of situation.
Yeah. So it seems like basically the polar opposite to his tour of the band.
Exactly.
From what I understand, maybe Dan, he wasn't very happy with that 1974 tour.
No, you can't ever believe what he says. Right. But yeah, from it seems like no, but like from interviews and stuff I've read with like Levon Helms and stuff, like everybody just kind of realized it was for the money. The set list for that tour is like kind of just the hits. It's almost like he's getting into beginning a nostalgia act almost, at that point. It's just it reminds me of like today. I've never gone and saw the Rolling Stones live, but I'm sure I could probably tell you at least 15 of the 20 songs they'll play. It was kind of getting into that where it was just going to be the hits. And Before the Flood is the, for people listening, Before the Flood is the album of the 74 tour.
Right.
And it's a pretty like, good picture of that tour.
Yeah. I find this very fascinating that, it's basically like a total reaction against the 1974 tour. I want to ask, as we continue to sort of describe this thing, Darren, were you, based on, I don't know how much you read up on this week or whatever, but do you get some of this vibe from listening to the music itself?
A little bit. Honestly, I found it, I was a little confused. for some reason in my mind, I thought post 60s, especially because, like, Dan, you mentioned, like, this large gap where he stops touring. I was thinking, like, I thought when Dylan went electric, I know he was still mixing in some, like, acoustic stuff.
Yeah.
And playing songs like that. But I totally did not anticipate any part of these live shows to involve him just with a guitar. You know what I mean? Like, I thought he was going to be electrifying all of the songs, and I know we'll get into, like, some of the different takes that he does on some of his older songs. But I was like, it just seemed really strange how he would just go up there and, on one of the shows he does, like, Mr. Tambourine Man, and then he does, like, of course, like, Blowing in the Wind. Like, it's just playing a hit, and I didn't, it's not that I hated it. I was just very surprised because it just didn't seem like Bob Dylan would suddenly go back and start playing some of his big, protest-like songs from the 60s.
Yeah, I think it's actually very fascinating because if you think about it, and maybe this isn't 100% accurate, okay, but we're entering a new era in the 70s of rock music because the 60s musicians who kind of, like, invent popular music as we think of it now. I mean, you can go back to Elvis and stuff like that, but it seems like something slightly different happened in the 60s with this counterculture music thing. They're, for the first time, kind of entering middle age, and maybe it, like, nobody realized that this is what would happen. You didn't have, like, a Rolling Stones to turn to and be like, oh yeah, eventually we turn into nostalgia acts. It's like basically all these artists are navigating, like, completely new waters, and I think it's incredibly, like, prescient that Dylan in 74 is, like, it seems to me, kind of recognizing that and being kind of afraid of it before it had ever happened to anyone. Do you kind of know what I'm saying, Dan?
Yeah, I completely agree, and it is kind of weird because like, he's slightly older than the Beatles or Rolling Stones or anything, so he's, like, a little bit ahead in that sense of hitting middle age and everything. And it's almost like he sees that and he's like, ooh, I don't want to just be some shitty dad rocker, even though that doesn't exist yet. And I think he never really goes back to it too. I mean, the late 78 tour and into the 80s are all really bad, into the 90s too. But he never really goes back to, like, playing huge sold out stadiums,
Yeah, and I do actually want to return to this idea of him playing the hits because I do think that's a really interesting choice. But we should continue sort of describing the scene here. As far as the band, you mentioned some people, but it kind of feels like the Desire band, and then a couple people added. As far as his band, people like a young T-Bone Burnett is here. Which kind of brings, I guess, that countrified thing. Of course, you've got, obviously, Scarlett Rivera, who's on Desire, of course, but the violin is very prevalent here. Most fascinating, though, like you mentioned, Dan, is Mick Ronson, who is most famous at this point for being on playing a lot of records with David Bowie, but most famously, he's in the Spiders from Mars, from the Ziggy Stardust era. And actually, I didn't know this before this week, but played a lot of guitar on Lou Reed's Transformer, which, of course, Bowie was involved in. That, to me, is a really interesting choice. Like this glam rocker, and maybe you could hear some of that, Darren, like this sloppy, wild electric guitar in this kind of folky, like, carnival thing.
Yeah, I did hear that, and I was kind of thinking to myself that, Dylan was maybe trying to, jive with some of the new rock and roll sounds of the 70s, you know what I mean?
Yeah. What do you make of that, Dan?
The whole Ronson thing, it's so strange, and I've read several books on the Rolling Thunder Revue itself, and it's like nobody really talks about it or, like, mentions how weird it is. I think it's because one thing I have read a lot is that he, like, was really quiet and stayed to himself a lot, and because even in the Netflix movie, you see him a couple of times, but there's never any, like, there's never anything, like, focused on him. And I always find it, like, so strange because, like, one, he's a big deal, especially in 75. It's right off the Spiders from Mars and everything. But yeah, it's like sometimes I can't remember exactly what song or lyric, but Dylan says something about like thunder, and then Ronson does that like whirr, like crazy, like this weird like sliding, just like real gnarly kind of distorted guitar thing, and it like that one little moment, it's always like, oh yeah, that's Ronson, but it's so strange that it's not a bigger deal that he's on that tour.
I know, and watching the movie, he sticks out just like he does like on the record, because he just looks
he's
like,
got a mullet, and he's like, he looks so glammy. Everyone else like looks like a country star.
I know. And so basically I started to sort of gravitate toward like one of these grand overarching theories that I'm like prone to doing, where basically, how do I start here? Punk has not yet emerged, okay? But it's about to, and it's kind of like in the air. Stuff like glam is sort of it's like the early stage of punk, and quite amazingly in the documentary, I think it's like one of the coolest parts, in fact, is Patti Smith features quite heavily early on, and she performs this song at like one of these impromptu kind of jam hangout things, and she's shown like sort of talking poetry at Bob Dylan, who like seems like sort of amused by this whole thing. But at first I was kind of thinking, it's like, okay, this is like, it's sort of showing somebody who Bob Dylan has had a major influence on, right? Which is obvious. And yet there's also this element of like, she's kind of like, just her presence is kind of inspiring him to kind of step up his game a little bit. And maybe not just her, but just the stuff that's going on. And I started to develop this theory, like punk is kind of the antidote to getting stale. In fact, punk emerges to sort of destroy classic rock once it's really gone stale, and it's almost like before punk has even started, or it's just starting with people like Patti Smith, whose Horses, I think, came out in 75, around the same time. It's like Dylan is sort of, again, in a prescient way, sensing that like something like punk, or, punk before punk even exists, would be the antidote to my problems with this arena rock, this nostalgia act that I'm, slipping into. Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is like, as an artist, I think he's like very aware of those kind of things. He's always like so reclusive, and doesn't do a lot of interviews, so there's not a lot of like him talking about contemporary artists at the time. But I think it's like fairly obvious. He is like friends with Patti Smith by that point, and I think they still are, because when he got the that Nobel thing, she like sang one of his songs for it and stuff. I think they're at least friendly. To know somebody like Patti Smith in 75, I think you would have had to have been like looking for it. It's kind of, especially at his age, it's not like he just, and he's not just hanging out at CBGB's on a Tuesday, like, right. I think he, like, somebody like him would have had to have like seeked that kind of thing out.
But this is like my kind of theory I'm developing is like, he's miserable, maybe even unhappy with recent work he's done, including the band tour, and maybe even some of these like kind of flop albums he's been doing. And he's searching for something, and he starts to sense this like thing that's happening, right? Which is like glam. This like might explain why you got to get Mick Ronson in there, because he's like, there's something hard edge about this, and it's going to become punk in just like 1-2 more years. But, Patti Smith, there's something new and like inspiring about this. And I want to ask you, Darren, did you feel like sort of a punk energy to the way he is performing on this set, and specifically like transforming some of these older songs and screaming over the top of them almost?
Yeah, I definitely did. And some of which I liked, some of which I wasn't like, I didn't like as much, you know what I mean? But I definitely kind of picked up on that. I mean, you guys are going pretty deep in like to the theory with, Patti Smith and stuff. But, I think even as a sort of an outside, just kind of listening, you can definitely tell there's a energy there. There's like almost like an on edge sort of feeling, like the way you sort of described, like Dylan seems like he's like unhappy, or he's just trying to like push the boundaries of what he's already done, try searching like a lot of the entire show kind of sounds like like a jam session, and they're just trying to figure out, or he's trying to figure out the next direction to go, and he'll take a song like, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall and just completely transform it, just to see, how far he can go with it. You know what I mean?
Right.
It doesn't matter to him. He's not trying to honor the song. And, one moment, and I don't know how I didn't know how to put this, but I made a note of it. Like, and I think it's on the bootleg, but you hear a fan like shout out, like, play some protest songs. You know what I mean? Like, as if we're back in the 60s all over again. It was just so weird. And like, I don't know. I don't understand Dylan's mindset at this point. Maybe Dan, you can kind of describe it. Like, is he, how does he react to that? Because he's playing some of those songs,
yeah.
But yet,
you see, it's like kind of strange because the 66 tour is the one where he's like antagonizing the audience. They're yelling stuff constantly, and he's play it fucking loud and stuff,
right?
And yelling back. At this one, because there's a few like times when people yell stuff, and he like jokes along with it and stuff. It's like somebody, I think it's in the movie, like somebody yells like Dylan for president, and he's like, president of what? And somebody yells like, play just like a woman, and he's like, just like a what? So he's like screwing around with people. It's not angry, like it's like he's having fun with it, which is a little strange. I don't know why there's that change.
Well, I want to like, to what Darren was just saying, it does feel like he's sort of like grappling with something. He's like reaching toward something, and the box set, we should mention, is basically set up to sketch that out, because you get a couple discs of rehearsals, and then you get like sort of a couple, like an early show, sort of a couple mid-period shows. The Montreal show is like the latest, an assortment of other things. And I think the idea of the box set is to sort of listen to these songs transform as he sort of, like, the Rolling Thunder Revue emerges. It's not like ready on the first night.
Yeah, it's not fully formed.
Yeah, and it kind of like builds. And my theory is that what he's like grasping for is punk without realizing it. Like, would you put any merit on that, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the Rolling Thunder Revue is I probably my second favorite tour of Dylan's. I really like 66, but like this is like a really like proto. He's like taking all these songs and like turning them into proto punk songs, or at least the non-acoustic ones, or the ones with bias. And like all the rock. He turns Hattie Carroll into like a proto punk song. One of the it's the version that's on the sampler disc that's like on Spotify. I forget what show it is. He like really changes Hattie Carroll, and he does like the Migos flow during a part of it. He does like he says it in like triplets. It's really rad. But
he does. He plays with like the phrasing every night.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes he's shouting like in a very like, I don't know, Sex Pistols kind of way. Patti Smith way might be more accurate, but I thought, as just a side note, maybe this would make like a really interesting podcast episode one day, but like this idea of classic rock people like reacting to punk is so interesting to me, because you remember we did an episode on our old podcast about like a dad rock thing, and Darren, you picked, what was it AC/DC's something?
Let There Be Rock.
Right, and they were like, their whole thing was like, okay, these punks like think they're hard, we can be way harder, right? And I think about like, I don't know, Rolling Stones' Some Girls is almost like, it's like the New York Dolls kind of play on like pretending to be the Rolling Stones. So this is like the Rolling Stones pretending to be the New York Dolls, pretending to be the Rolling Stones. And like, there's some like untapped thing we could explore. And I think this would fit right into it, of like these classic rock artists actually reacting to and sort of embracing punk as it's developing, because they're musicians, they're artists. It must have been an exciting time. But that gets me to the thing that you brought up, Darren, which is the inclusion of some of these older songs, which seems almost counter to this like progressive, like pushing forward idea, right? And as part of my theory that I was working on, I kind of think that, in some ways, like punk is always kind of a return to something. It's like the Ramones are returning to like 50s rock. And in a way, there is nothing more punk than when Bob Dylan like went electric, and or even like before that, when Bob Dylan is like playing really radical protest songs. And it almost feels like, as he's sort of grasping toward something like punk, these kinds of songs make sense in that context. Do you kind of know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the twist that he puts on these songs too. You know what I mean? I don't want to call it like punkifying it or whatever, but like, you know, again, I go back to like A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Like after I heard that live, I had to go back to the studio version and like remind myself of like the quiet acoustic, you know, poem that was on that record. Because here, and it's actually my least favorite of these like transformations, because I just feel like that's just a song that you can't
really
loud.
Oh, yeah. God.
I like this version even more than the original. I swear to God.
Yeah, I'm with you. That pretty much all the ones that he turns into, like Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You. The Rolling Thunder versions of that are way better. Hattie Carroll, the
but you know what I'm saying? Like when those songs came out, they were radical. They were punk.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like. And it's kind of interesting because it's like he's getting interested in protest songs again, because he writes Hurricane, you know, famously about this injustice. Reuben Hurricane Carter, this boxer, wrongfully imprisoned at the time and eventually released. So he's like kind of getting interested in this. And there are a lot of songs like that in this set, including Hattie Carroll, like you mentioned, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Blowing in the Wind. Dark as a Dungeon is like, you know, I want to touch on this, but it's a 40s like folk song, but it's about, you know, like coal miners and the shitty situation they're in, you know, stuff like I Shall Be Released is kind of like a protest song. You know, they're kind of like littered throughout this. And it's kind of like when you are facing turning into a nostalgia act, it feels to me like he's trying to make these songs radical again, like they once were, you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You know, certainly coming out there and just playing, you know, in 1975, playing an acoustic version of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall just would lose a lot of effect, because by 1975, it's not really, you know, I mean, it is a protest song, but, you know, the 60s are over. Like that time period is gone. Like, so it would really be like going backwards if he was just to come out there and play that. So the only way to give that song more relevance, right, is to transform it, and to me kind of bury the lyrics behind all the sound. But, you know, that's my opinion.
Well, I think, like, I mean, looking at his whole career, he essentially, like, after 66, he never like plays the song straight, you know, again,
right.
You know, even 74, they're a little straight, but even, you know, he'll take a acoustic song and now it's sort of electric, you know, with band accompaniment. But, you know, up until today, you know, when I saw Dylan last year, and, you know, the song
18,
I've seen him a bunch. But, you know, like the songs are literally like unrecognizable. One of my favorite things when I see him, you know, nowadays is like when the crowd realizes what song it is, right. You know, like, because people, you know, a lot of times, you know, if you're at a show, you know, the first couple notes of a song you like, oh, everybody's cheering. But with him, it's like the first time you hear the chorus, or when he says, you know, like the name of the song in it, you're like, oh yeah, fuck, this is Hard Rain, or something, you know, like. And he's basically always done that. You know, in the 80s, it was shitty, but he was changing the songs, you know. I maybe it's just a way to not be bored, because I feel like I would be. Yeah,
but I mean, I think there's like real intention here, which is like, you know, it's sort of.
I think you can have both. You can have the intention and you do it to like keep everything fresh. You know, not only keep it fresh for yourself, but keep the song fresh. Because I think with him, and you know, on these shows, he changes the lyrics to like "Knocking on Heaven's Door" and "Civil Twist of Fate" a lot. You know, I think it's just like his songs are never like finished. You know, it's like he's almost always working on the even to today. You know.
Yeah, but I think there's something about the sort of there's like a revolutionary spirit to the Rolling Thunder Revue as a whole, and that's why these kinds of songs are like important to this set. And you know, I think about, and I kind of wonder, actually, I'm sure that there's like a self-awareness here, but think about This Land Is Your Land, okay? Woody Guthrie song that closes I think, literally every night on this leg of the tour.
Yeah, it does.
So This Land is Your Land is the like perfect example of what happens to music. Okay, so that's like a genuinely radical folk song.
Mm-hmm.
It's about like income inequality and like, you know, fuck the rich. This land is our land. You know, I don't think he ever says fuck in the song, but he might as well. He's a radical dude, Woody Guthrie. As everybody knows who's seen like the pictures, you know, This Machine Kills Fascists on his guitar. And yet, what has happened to the song This Land Is Your Land? Like, it's a nursery rhyme. It's sung like by children.
You literally learn it in elementary school, yeah.
Yep.
It's lost all of its power, which is just something that happens. And like when The Who play My Generation in 2018, like a genuinely radical proto-punk song itself has lost all of its, you know, power and meaning because he's like, you know, whatever, 85, 100 years old, and he's singing like, hope I die before I get old. And so I feel like including these older songs and reinventing them on this tour in particular is really important because it's like he wants to make himself radical again, but he wants to radicalize these songs again that were genuinely radical. You kind of agree with me there?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, like I said, I think he's trying to not only keep them fresh for himself, but just fresh as songs, you know? So you don't start learning them in kindergarten.
Yeah. What do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, I think it's a bit of both, like Dan had mentioned. You know, certainly playing night after night the same sort of set list. You know, a lot of bands get away with it, and I guess they're fine. But I mean, Dylan just he seems restless. Like he just would never want to go out there and play the same songs the same way he recorded it night after night. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And at the same time, it's not just like, all right, we'll just add some drums and electric guitar and it'll be fine. Like you mentioned, like it does seem like there's intention behind it. There's creativity behind it. Like what does a song like, oh, I don't know, like Blowing in the Wind, or, you know, I keep going back to the same, like It Ain't Me, Babe, for instance. Like what does that song mean in 1975 to like Bob Dylan? You know what I mean? Like it's not the same song that it was before. So I'm truly fascinated by it. I think it's an amazing thing, and it's almost baffling that a lot of other artists just never really tried to do that sort of thing. Like it almost creates, you know, it makes this whole tour like truly worth listening to. Like imagine if all these songs just sounded like they were originally recorded. They're just live versions. Like would we even be talking about it right now?
No, exactly. I think that's what, like, the reason that like these box sets work. And like, I mean, no other artist, I mean, I know I'm a huge Dylan fan, but no other artist besides Kanye really do you, like, you know, each tour. And like, you know, I could hear a clip of something and say, you know, I could get you pretty close to what tour that is. Especially things like Rolling Thunder and 66 that are like radically different. Right. You know, most artists aren't like that. You know, it's just, you know, what's the difference in, you know, the Rolling Stones 69 tour and their 89 tour? You know, I'm sure they're playing, you know, Start Me Up and it sounds pretty much the same, you know, over and over.
Yeah, Dylan was really thinking about his profitability.
No, he's smart. You know, he was like
hedging his bets.
He's like, there's going to be this thing called box sets in 2019. Right. I would be able to
record everything. We're going to re-release it.
They're going to be worth $150 a piece. Trust me.
Trust me.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's like, you know, that's kind of my favorite thing about this set is that you get to follow the course of it because it's like he's not really sure what he's after, but he kind of gets there slowly. And, you know, it just makes me so aware of this. Like, I think it's such an interesting topic that goes like even far beyond Bob Dylan, which is, you know, this idea that like artists have to kind of figure out a way to challenge themselves or something, or like keep pushing on because it's so easy to get complacent. We talk about this a lot, and you can like hear it because, you know, this tour is relatively like very short. Okay. And by the time of Montreal, I forget the exact date.
December 4th. I'm looking at it. I didn't know it off the top of my head.
But I mean, when Hurricane comes out as a single, it's like November 75. Okay. So basically when he starts playing Hurricane on December 4th in Montreal, the audience applauds, like you were mentioning, Dan. they know it already. And it's like there's a certain antagonistic relationship that you almost have to have with your fans because they'll ruin your shit, you know? They'll turn it into a nostalgia act like that. You know, when you play the hit, they applaud and they give you that adulation and it feels good. And it's like, it becomes automatic. We talked about this a little bit with the Grateful Dead, where it's like it becomes like sort of a craft where it's just like, you know how to get the applause, you know how to get the encore, you know, and you got to fight with your fans your whole life.
No, they talk about that in the movie a little bit. I think it's Roger McGuinn talks about Joni Mitchell. And when she joined the Rolling Thunder, she only played brand new songs.
Right.
And, he was saying that she felt bad she wasn't getting like, a huge pop, during her set and stuff. And he was saying, you're not playing anything anybody's ever heard before. But she like stuck with it. And he said he really respected her for it. And I do too. I think that's like a really, you as a fan, if I go to a show, part of you does want to hear those hits and the things you came for. But also I kind of like going to a show and, not getting that. I guess it sort of depends on who it is. But if I'm a big fan of somebody, it's kind of cool to get something you've not heard before, or in a way you've not heard it, or something. To be challenged as the audience member is sometimes nice.
So, I know. Go on, Darren.
Well, I had like a sort of an outside question because it was just coming to mind as you guys were discussing. Like, whose decision was it to like record this tour and like film it, right? Because I mean, it's not like everybody who goes on tour is constantly like getting these like incredible recordings.
Yeah, Dylan recorded it because he was making this movie. Do we want to get into it now, or you want to hold on?
Yeah, give us like the short version.
Yeah, he's making this movie. It's called Ronaldo and Clara. And it was going to be this mix of concert footage and like a regular, story movie, not like a behind the scenes thing. But it would be filmed on the off hours, sort of behind the scenes, but everybody's playing a character. And so that's why it's recorded. Montreal and one of the Massachusetts, two of the Massachusetts shows were like audio recorded with like a mobile recording studio and stuff. And completely filmed, which all that footage has never been released.
Yeah, but this is like what the Netflix film is basically comprised of, is stuff that was being filmed.
Or Ronaldo
and Clara.
Oh, so it's not actually showing like the concert performances?
Oh, it is. It is.
Okay. Yeah.
They're filmed, but there's also stuff that's like...
And they're in Ronaldo and Clara too.
Yeah, and there's also stuff like... this is where shit gets like fucking wild with this with this whole thing. Is like basically like there's a scene in the Netflix documentary where like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan are talking about their breakup. Okay, so like famous couple in the 60s. Another reason why the Rolling Thunder Revue was like so publicized, part of it is that it's like a reunion of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. And they're like basically discussing their breakup, and it's like accurate what they're saying, but they're actually playing characters. She's like dressed as the Lady in White or something like that,
but Dylan is Ronaldo,
yeah, and like so I don't even know how to get into this, but basically there's a weird consciousness to this whole thing of like, Dylan got to be Dylan. Okay, he's got to like fuck around with you, because the documentary film and Ronaldo and Clara, they're basically like self-consciously fictionalizing what would otherwise be a normal documentary. And we should talk a little bit about, maybe you can describe it, Dan, the costumes and the face paint and the masks, and even like they sort of had like character names as they're performing. Can you just give a summary of that whole aspect of this? Yeah,
the Netflix documentary sort of, and it's because it's, sort of fictionalized. The masks are a little blown out of proportion. That was on Halloween, and they only wore those on Halloween. But the whole rest of the tour, like Dylan paints his face white, and there's a bunch of different like reasons he's given. The most famous one is like he saw it in some movie. He said that he wanted his face to be visible from far away. I don't know what painting it white helps with that. But yeah, I mean, just no real straight answer.
He said it was Kiss that inspired him.
Yeah, in the movie, yeah. But yeah, and then everybody, Scarlett Rivera like paints her face a bunch, and New Earth does too and stuff. Everybody sort of like does this kind of, it's like a circus act, to go back to it. So everybody's like in on it. It's not like just Dylan dressing funny or something.
Yeah, and they're like prototypical characters almost. Like, Dylan has like flowers in his hat and stuff. He's like the troubadour or like the balladeer or something of like this old idea of this. I forget the names of what everybody calls, but it's kind of like, Scarlett Rivera, what they call her, like the Lady of Swords or something like that. But she's sort of like a gypsy. I know that's an offensive word. Roma kind of, spiritual woman thing. Like, it's like they're all almost like little figurines. And that's another aspect of this show, which is like in this kind of looking backwards thing. Like you were mentioning, they're going to small towns. They're trying to play unannounced. They're trying to be like a traveling circus or something. Like in the old days when performers of various kinds would go from town to town and you would have never heard of them before. And you would have this kind of like intimate new experience, right? And so like Dylan is kind of trying to, recreate that, but in this like weird self-conscious way where it's like a show. Does any of this like surprise you, Darren, or did you have a sense of this kind of stuff?
No, I really didn't. That's why I guess I, had that question about why was this even recorded. I had no idea that there was this intention behind it to create this film and all these actors. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that really comes across so much in just listening to the performances. To me, it just sounds like, yes, there was a decision to record these things, and because of that, he wanted to be more creative about how those performances were done so that it's just not, your standard, whatever a standard Bob Dylan show would be anyway. But like, there just seemed like, I don't know, I guess I didn't see as much visualization while I was listening to it. Like I think about like Beyonce, for instance. And again, I didn't watch the Beyonce film, but you could kind of see it in your head a whole lot. To me, I just imagine a bunch of people, a bunch of guys, and like Joan Baez or whatever on stage, kind of lined up with guitars, just rocking out. Sometimes like singing on the same mic, kind of stuff like that, like a Bruce Springsteen type of concert or something.
They do sort of do that, just in like a strange, sort of distorted way. Because there is it's funny you say like singing on the same mic, because there is like a lot of that going on during this tour.
There is, but there's also like, Dylan does this thing, and I, it's not like I've seen a lot of concert footage, but he seems particularly animated to me, and he does stuff like when a song mentions like wild geese, he like pretends to look up, as if there's geese flying, like he's like very acting a little bit, and
especially on Isis, because he's not playing guitar.
And then there's even like stuff where, I mean, maybe they're just playing around, but like when they're playing Knocking on Heaven's Door, like him and McGuinn are like making the weirdest faces at each other while they're sharing the mic. There's something like extra cartoony animated about it. And the whole thing has like this self-consciousness of like it's supposed to kind of be a circus or something like that. And there's also like a weird... So what I can't wrap my head around, and I want to ask both of you guys, I mean, does he sound sincere on these recordings, or like it's a fucking circus?
Judging if Dylan's sincere about something ever is, because that's the whole thing. Everybody says, self-portrait sucks, but like, he did it on purpose. It's like that whole thing, it's like you never really know if he says, were the entire 80s of his career sincere? Like people literally like wonder that. I have books on was the 80s sincere, so I can't answer that.
What do you
think?
I
mean, I am willing to buy into the circus idea. I mean, like, knowing what I do know about Dylan, which isn't as much as Dan, I feel like this is like almost like a lightning in a bottle type of moment. Like the next tour, if there was a tour right after this, I just can't imagine being the same thing. You know what I mean? I feel like there's a sense of like, it's a little frantic. Like, I feel like we're kind of going off the rails just a little bit, not like super crazy, but like, this just really seems like a snapshot of the moment, and it was not going to really happen again.
I think that's actually a good point. You said, if there was another tour right after this, and there is, and it's supposed to be the second leg of the Rolling Thunder Revue, and pretty quickly the wheels come off of it, and it just turns into not... the magic is completely lost.
Well, I want to dive deeper into this, but before we move on, I just wanted to mention quickly that I finally decided after thinking about this all week that I think he is like very sincere here, and that I find like the second set particularly just incredibly moving. Honestly, like we focused mostly on Montreal. We'll talk about it specifically a little bit later on, but like Sarah is just like the way he plays it is kind of pure honest, pure heartbreaking. I mean, Tangled Up in Blue, it's like there's so much feeling here, and I also cannot I just can't accept that he doesn't actually passionately care about the subject matter of like Hurricane or even any of the other protest songs. Like there's something kind of self-conscious here where he's like playing around, but if you just look at it, it's like he really means this shit. And I even think about stuff like, so there's like this in the film, it's like this self-consciousness, this like kind of, it's fiction, but it's not really all the time. And like I mentioned with that like Joan Baez scene he has, it's like, maybe I'm just being like conspiracy. I know like Bob Dylan fans are like prone to this, but it's like after he does he does like sort of a rockin' set. He then moves into like Joan Baez duets, which are a bit softer. And then he starts up on a solo acoustic thing, and then the full band kind of comes back in for the last quarter of it. And him and Joan Baez, they sing together beautifully, and it's like the second set always seems to start with a fucking breakup song. Like, if you look at it, and it's like, in the news, people are all talking about, are Dylan and Joan Baez back together? Like, what happened to their bromance and stuff? And like... I get conspiratorial, but I'm like, is he like actually addressing with this song, the breakup with Joan Baez, or that he's not over yet, or like what, or is he just sort of playing around? But anyway, I threw a lot out there, but you guys kind of agree with me. There's a lot of sincerity here.
Yeah, for sure. Going back to like Hurricane, for instance, I feel like he's like yelling the song. Like he's like desperately is like, listen, this guy is in jail. He shouldn't be in jail. Somebody do something about it. I think he even mentions, I think on the Spotify playlist, or maybe it was the bootleg one. Right before the song, he's like, hey, if anybody's like into politics or like has some power, like get this guy out of here. You know what I mean? Like he's serious. He's totally serious about it.
Yeah, that's the bootleg series version. And they show in the movie a like little truncated clip of him like going to the record label and saying like he just wants to get this record on the streets as fast as possible. They're trying to talk to him like, we think it won't get a lot of play on this kind of radio, or but it will over here. And his I think it's Louis Kemp that's with him, says like he just wants to get it on the street, like people, once it's in people's hands, they can play it if they want to, like he just wants this song to the people. So yeah, I think like Hurricane is definitely sincere, and Sarah is one of the weirdest things to me. That like that song just in general, it's like the only like definitely autobiographical, like very obviously like he's using the real name of his real wife. Like Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands is about her, but she's never mentioned. In fact, Sarah even mentions that Sad-Eyed Lady is about her, and it's it's like weird enough that song exists, but it's like extra weird that you like play that every night on a tour. It just seems so like personal for a person who's like notoriously impersonal. That's always confused me.
I think that's I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I did kind of want to ask, half facetiously, is this like Rolling Thunder Revue, Dylan having like kind of a midlife crisis a little bit? He's going through a divorce, and it's like, I got to get out there. I got to recapture what music was like when I was young, like when I was hungry before I was famous. Like
he hasn't had a divorce yet, but yeah.
But I mean, he's already written one album about his marriage is in shambles, so he can't be too happy. You kind of, it's a little bit of a midlife crisis, but
I feel like the 74 tour is more midlife crisisy. At least this one, he's like, he's energized and like making something new. I think it's more midlifey to be just out there playing the hits. But I guess you could say like, oh, maybe he's trying to hitch his wagon on this, punk thing.
Maybe he's finding a way to make himself happy again. Maybe like that's the impetus, and we listened to, you recommended it, Dan, this podcast by Rolling Stone magazine. I guess it was like a short podcast with interview with somebody and then with Roger McGuinn.
Yeah.
And, they both said that he was like extremely happy on this tour, which, would make sense. So on that note, I kind of want to talk about like how successful this tour was. If you think about it as kind of like a reaction to what was going on before, as kind of like an experiment, because music has not reached nostalgia phase really yet. How successful he was. And you were getting to it, Dan, like after all this Sincerity, after all this like punk fire, it turns out the tour is not making very much money, right? And so we do like sort of a watered down stadium version in 1976, and it's not supposed to be very great, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of the earlier shows are like not so bad. They're all in Florida, which is cool. And but by the end, the live album Hard Rain is from the '76, and I think it's either the last show or the penultimate show of the tour. It's one of the last shows of the tour, and it's not awful, but it just sounds, especially nowadays, because nothing was released from the first tour until Bootleg 5 officially. So like for the longest time, really the only thing people knew of the Rolling Thunder Revue was the 76 version in Hard Rain, which is just really, it's just the spark's gone. Dylan seems like not into it anymore. Like he's just sort of going through the motions. The makeup's gone, the hat's gone. He's wearing like a do-rag at this point. And like it's just like it's not. He's playing stadiums, and it's just there's nothing there. There's none of that like punk energy anymore, and it's weird that like the punk energy just completely gets lost too, because the next record's Street Legal, which is like completely devoid of any of this sort of energy and whatnot.
Yeah.
So why do you think that happened? Do you think it just the tour went on too long and you just
I think it. So on one hand, it's like financial, right? Because
a lot of that was he spent so much money making that dumbass movie.
Yeah. But you think about, I started to think about it in these terms, like basically the whole time the Rolling Thunder Revue is going on in 75, it's developing this insane mythology. Like everybody's talking about it, because not only is it his first tour, in a long time, almost 10 years, it's like shrouded in secrecy. It's going like small town to small town, and like in an unannounced kind of way. There's something radical about it. People are writing about like he's more inspired than he's been in years, and it's really developing this mythology. I'm sure people are reading about it. They kind of show this in the documentary a little bit, but people are reading about it in Rolling Stone and stuff, and they're like, well, I wish I could go see this. But so on one hand, it's like you run into problems because despite Bob Dylan's greatest efforts, he is extremely fucking famous, and these little unannounced shows, it sounds like from the documentary, have lines like around the block. Mm-hmm. People wait like days to get in. It's probably privileging like wealthy people who can afford to scalp tickets and whatever,
but it still didn't make any money.
Well,
no, because he's playing like 1,000-seaters.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And it's like, so basically what I was getting to is like, so then you've got this mythology, and then it's like that classic thing where now all of America gets a chance to see it. Like, when something like Broadway show happens,
exactly.
And it's like, oh my God, Hamilton. And then not the entire original cast goes on tour,
right.
And you can see it at like your local civic center or whatever. And like, that's what I felt like 76 Rolling
That's a
Thunder
good analogy.
Is.
It's still it's the same story, just with less good actors and everything. Yeah.
So it could only last for so long, is kind of what you're saying, and like, I mean, you can't.
Yeah, it's just unsustainable.
Right, you can't bottle up that energy and just keep on going with
exactly.
it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should try to dive into that, because like punk as a movement only lasts like 2 years. is this the same problem? What do you think, Darren?
I mean, it seems like it. You know, I kind of mentioned it before. Like, listening to this, I just couldn't imagine the next tour carrying this type of energy. You know, this type of sincerity. You know what I mean? Because it's hard. I think it's hard to replicate this, even though, you know, the original idea is like, okay, we're gonna do this tour night after night. I don't want to play the songs the way I know them. Let's change it up. Doing that still requires you to like go, you know, city to city over and over again. How can you, the way you guys are describing this sort of circus feel, this looseness, whatever, like, number one, it's not sustainable, like, financially, if you're playing all these small places. So then you expand it to these much larger, you know, arena kind of things, and now you've sort of lost the original intent, right? Like, you know, the circus typically is not filling 100,000 seats or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what it's usually ever meant for. It's under like one tent, and if you can get in, great.
Exactly.
And so how, you know, to me, it like punk, it hits the first time. It's kind of like lightning in the bottle. It makes its statement, and then it moves on, or it, you know, fades away. How can it stay? You know, it's like the Nirvana effect. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
If Kurt stayed on, what would we be seeing now? You know, all that stuff.
Exactly. Anything with like a ton of energy, it's just like it's like energy is so hard to sustain. You know, like punk, like you said, only lasts like 2 years. It's like when your sort of thing is like being shocking. You know, things stop being shocking once you're exposed to it. You know,
and everybody figures it out. Yeah,
exactly. And that's like what happens, I think, here, and, you know, just punk in general, and anything like that.
I know. And like, basically, like I was saying earlier, like, nostalgia will win. It will eventually win. Like, you know, the fans,
because this
will
becomes
destroy
nostalgia, you know, we're
it does.
Yeah.
The fans will like sort of ruin your music. You know, it's kind of like, you know what, like, people will be, like at a Pink Floyd concert, you know, like really begging, Roger Waters to like spit on them or something like that. Like, wouldn't that be cool? Just like, you know, the shows I've read about where he spits on the audience and tells them to go fuck themselves. Like, I wish he would do that to me, you know, like,
no, exactly.
It becomes like parody, self-parody.
Exactly.
And so that's the thing I felt like I was trying to get at, is like, Dylan, prescient as ever. I swear to God, I'm not like, I just sound like a crazy fanboy, but I really believe in this, that like, he even saw that ahead of time. And I feel like that's what he's doing with the like face paint and the playing around stuff, is like, he's almost like acknowledging the impossibility of really doing this. You know, it's like, I want to get genuinely inspired and tap into like something real and escape nostalgia. And yet I know that at the end of the day, I am famous, and I would just be playing pretend. Like, I would just be kind of playing a game where I go to 1,000-seat, concert halls unannounced, and I can never really do it. Like, I feel like, because like the whole film has these fictional elements, and he's lying about stuff, and they're actors playing like non-existent people in the history of this. And it's like, am I going too far to say that there's a certain awareness of the impossibility of this task he's set out for himself?
No, I think you have to be aware, you know, especially when you're like I talked about a little bit earlier, like when you're this, big of an artist, and like somebody who has like changed popular culture, you know, over and over again, you know, you have to have some sort of awareness and, knowledge to do that thing, you know, like maybe you get lucky and you stumble into, you know, a hit or something that's like really original, you know, once, maybe twice. But the amount of times like Dylan has, you know, stumbled onto it there's got to be some sort of awareness and purpose.
I really think that he is, you know, I sound crazy. I want to know, Darren, do I sound crazy? But I think he's just like one of the actual smartest people that like ever lived. And it's just like, he's sitting there in 1974 and he's like, before punk even exists, he's like, I know how to reinvigorate myself. I'll go punk. And then before he's even done it, he's like, but I know that it's impossible, and punk will die. And so I will
imagine him just like saying all of this.
Yeah. Himself. And then he's like, and after that, I'm going to turn Christian. And, like I seriously think he's thinking about this shit.
Out
he's
his
playing,
whole career.
It's like 4D chess this dude is playing.
Pitchfork released like that article last week. It was like the 8 best Dylan documentaries or something. Mm-hmm. And one of them was like this BBC thing from this horrible movie he was in called Hearts of Fire in the 80s. And I had never seen it, so I watched it. And like the last like a little bit of it is like an interview with him, and I think it's 84 in the documentary, and he's like talking about like the way music is today, and he's basically talking about like the hits of the 80s, and he says in about 5 years' time something's going to come along and erase it. And it's like literally, it's when Bleach comes out, like Nirvana Bleach is the amount of time he says in that. And it's like, because I thought I was watching it, I was like, fuck, that's Bleach comes out the year he just mentioned, and he's completely right. It does, it completely erases it's more Nevermind, but regardless, same band at least.
I think he's like more in touch with these trends than most people. Are we crazy, Darren?
No, I don't think so. Bob Dylan, besides the Rolling Stones, is like one of the only like major, pillars to actually come out of the 60s. The Beatles aren't there. Like, Doors are gone. Like, a lot of bands end in the 60s. And here we have Dylan make it through the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s. The guy's learned a lot, you know what I mean? And I think he's very observant. I think he is incredibly intelligent. I think he's very much... he's got his finger kind of on the pulse. I think he has a really good idea. He's very aware, in other words, of what he's doing. You know what I mean? And like, he's kind of always been like, I don't really care, what everyone thinks. You know what I mean? Just as much as he was an antagonist in the 60s live shows, I think him turning Christian and all these other things that he decided to do is like, he doesn't care. If he wanted to monetize his career, although I think he has, for God's sakes, he has so many, records.
Yeah.
He's getting checks all the time. Anyway, but he could have definitely gone with the trends. He could have done a lot of different things, right? Through the 80s and 90s, Dan, but
no, exactly.
He just didn't,
even like, whether it's on purpose or an accident or whatever, releasing Self-Portrait, or even if you want to go back, like releasing Nashville Skyline, which is like this, he sings completely different. It's just a straight country record. Just a couple years after Blonde on Blonde, even following up Blonde on Blonde with an acoustic album. He's like famously goes electric, and does this antagonistic tour, and then releases a acoustic album. Mostly acoustic. Like, he seems to do what he wants to do. A lot of I don't think as much as the Christian period is awful, I feel like, if Mick Jagger like converted to Christianity, I feel like he would have maybe kept it to himself, or maybe he'd be outspoken about it, but like I don't think there'd be a Christian Mick Jagger record or Rolling Stones record. You know what I mean? Like to put it in people's face, and maybe it's just solely to be antagonistic.
Yeah, I think, what we're getting at is like, he's kind of uncompromising, but he's also really aware of like what's going on, and he likes to react against it. And, we should mention that, without getting too off topic, it's stuff like Empire Burlesque sounds like the fucking 80s. He's not like trailblazing in that sense, but he does seem to, like, maybe not 100% of the time, but he's just really got this knack for reacting, I think. And so back to Rolling Thunder, what can other artists learn from Rolling Thunder? I think about, again, sort of facetiously, but when you hear this word, you should like run far away, but like, this is a back to basics record, or, you know what I mean? Back to their roots album, like it's going to be shit. But I would describe Rolling Thunder as, in a way, kind of that. There's some new sonic elements for sure, but he's kind of like even consciously bringing up these old protest songs to sort of like reinvigorate them. Like I was saying, it is kind of a back to basics thing. So how does he do it right where so many fail?
I think you just, part of it comes with being, in my opinion, like the greatest artist of a generation. If everybody could do it, they would do it. But I don't know, because you're right. Like normally that whole back to basics thing usually what that means is I'm just gonna rip myself off and try to make The Wall Part 2 or whatever kind of thing.
Or like I sold out for a while and it's not
paying off
money as it
exactly.
was, so I'm gonna try to get my old fans back or something.
No, exactly. And so it's weird because Rolling Thunder does feel like people always say the old Dylan's back and stuff. But it's it is the old Dylan, but it's still it's new. It's not like just a rehash.
Maybe it's just the spirit of the old
Dylan. That's a good way to put it, I think, because we're not just getting, I mean, even Desire as a record, Desire's not bringing it back home Part 2 or Highway 62 or something, it's like a whole separate thing, but still of the spirit of him. Yeah.
What do you think, Darren?
Well, I think there's a creative approach to it. I think you lean into the old stuff just enough to not make it like a nostalgia act entirely, and you also don't lean too far into the new stuff, because I mean, surely he has way more. He has more than enough material post 60s that he could have used and completely left the protest songs behind, but he chose to include some of them, not all of them. There wasn't an entire show of just those things. Right. We get a lot of Desire, like the majority of Desire is on these live sets, right? But mixed in, you're kind of reminded, you're brought back to okay, this is why we love Bob Dylan, right? You hear the cheering on songs that are very familiar to the audience, right? It flows really well. I mean, I have no choice but to admit that Bob Dylan sat down and looked at his set list and said, this is how I want this to go, because there's a very clear flow to it,
Yeah, no, exactly.
I mean, he works it out meticulously, and there is, I honestly did want to compliment the flow of these sets, because it's kind of like a bunch of heaters right away, and then it cools down for the Joan Baez thing, but it's interesting because it's almost like acoustic, but then it's like the instruments slowly come back in, and then we go to the solo acoustic, and then the band sort of comes back in, but it kind of stays sort of mellow. I noticed that you can hear Scarlett Rivera's violin a lot more prominently in these last couple songs, because Mick Ronson isn't wiling out over everything anymore. It mellows out with One More Cup of Coffee and Sarah, and even Just Like a Woman. It flows wonderfully, I think, and so it's like a fantastic show. We're not this would actually be an interesting podcast topic, moments when artists were completely antagonistic with their fans, Metal Machine music or some shit like that. It's this isn't that, right, Dan?
No. Rolling Thunder doesn't even really seem antagonistic, because it's sort of hard to think we've always heard this when I never heard a Rolling Thunder concert before I knew Desire, but at this point none of these people have ever heard Desire because it's not out yet. They've maybe heard Hurricane on some of the later shows. I think there's only a couple shows post Hurricane single. So it's hard to think you sort of think of it as him playing all these songs that everybody, that at least everybody's sort of familiar with, even, some hits, but, B-sides or whatever. But really a good portion of the show would be completely new to everybody in that building, And that's sort of that's sort of an antagonistic idea, but he doesn't seem that way. And the reaction, everybody seems to be really digging those songs,
Yeah. I mean, so maybe it's something like that. That's the takeaway. You got to be challenging, but not not antagonistic. And you can't just challenge yourself all the time. You got to challenge your audience. I mean, your audience likes to be challenged. I was thinking about this when we were talking about Tool a couple episodes ago, funnily enough, where I was what drew all of us to Tool as, young high schoolers? And, maybe we're just the kind of music listeners that we like to be challenged. And at that time in our life, it was very challenging music, and, so I think that's one big lesson that bands could learn from the Rolling Thunder thing. I want to spend a little bit sort of touching, not too long because Darren didn't see it, but touching on the documentary, which, like we mentioned, is full of all this fake, tongue-in-cheek type stuff, but also ends, weirdly, in a way that I want to ask you about, Dan, by listing, like, basically never-ending tour dates for the rest of his career after this. After this long gap from 66 to 75, he like tours like crazy for the rest of his life, basically. Why? What was the documentary trying to say? What is that? Yeah,
I don't know. I was thinking about that too. I guess to show that like maybe, maybe there's saying that that's like what reinvigorated like his spark of wanting to get on the road or something. Because between 75 and 88, he only takes a couple years off in like randomly, and then from I think it's June 88 is when the ever-ending tour starts, which is going on to this day. Whoa. He's like not taken more than a few months off since 1988. Like, oh
my god,
you guys are born in 89, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I was born in 88.
So like literally
our whole lives.
Your entire life. He's been on this one tour, I mean, it's nuts that I've seen a tour at age 30 that started when I was months old. It's nuts.
So basically, Darren, to just describe it, it's like the film ends. It does like these sort of clips sometimes of like old silent films like doing magic tricks and stuff, so it's obviously kind of like playing with, hey, we're fucking with you a little bit in this, but then it ends by just showing every year and all of the tour dates listed, and it just cycles through like every year up to the present, basically. And it's like, so I thought on one hand, is it trying to say this experiment was a massive success because it like broke the floodgates open, Dylan found his inspiration, found his muse again, can't stop working? Or was it trying to say, because we know that not all those years were good years, as we've been talking about, is it trying to say, like, after this one hurrah, touring became his, like, a job for him, and he just accepted it as such, like, based, without having seen it, but just based on our discussion, Darren, do you have kind of an opinion on that?
I mean, it kind of sounds like that, it almost sounds like, this documentary is for this tour, but don't expect to see a documentary about any subsequent tour.
It kind of feels that way.
It's just nothing is as unique or as interesting as this very first one.
And he's not above like kind of almost shitting on himself, because all of that tongue-in-cheek stuff, there's a lot of like toying with himself, right, Dan?
Oh yeah, I mean, he even says in the movie, they ask him talk about, and he starts trying to explain the review, and he goes, that's clumsy bullshit,
Yeah.
And then essentially says that it didn't mean anything. It was a tour about nothing.
Don't read too much into it, we have been tonight.
Yeah, exactly. He'd probably he's going to be so pissed when he listens to
this. Yeah, so some mixed messages there, mixed messages in the whole documentary, which is constantly like being really sincere. Like you get like Allen Ginsberg being like, we're out to discover America, like we're out to, rediscover ourselves. And I love like, the tour starts in Plymouth, which obviously if like we're thinking of this as like, this tour is supposed to be a revolution, like what better place to start than Plymouth, and yet you can't help but feeling that like, Ginsberg is like this prankster who's kind of fucking with you too. And then at one point they this can't be true, that they basically cut his set because it's too boring, and he has to do like taking out the trash and like carrying people's luggage. Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I've never read it.
Has to be a troll. Has to be.
I've never read it, and I feel like, wouldn't you have showed some footage of him doing that or something? So I do kind of think that's...
But you never know, because it's like, could be Ronaldo and Clara's stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. But let's talk about like the fake stuff and all, because I saw the movie in theaters the day before it was on Netflix. Obviously hadn't read anything about it. So I just went in. I was expecting, Scorsese made No Direction Home like 10 or so years ago. And it's just a straight regular documentary. So I was really just expecting that. So I watched it, in a theater. People are laughing, cheering. Everyone seems to be taking it completely at face value. I did.
Right.
I did. And then I remember driving home, I told my wife, I said, I thought it was really weird. I've never heard about the Sharon Stone thing. Like in all the books I've read, like, because she's famous.
Yeah,
and
so mention it. So Sharon Stone says that as like a 18-year-old, she meets Dylan on the tour and sort of befriends him a little bit. And that's all bullshit.
Yeah. And like, there's like the filmmaker, you know, I thought like, I thought Dylan just made the film, but you know, his name was like weird. And I'd be like, it's just a name I forgot. The promoter, like, I don't know who the promoter, that's not a name I'm gonna know. That politician, right. I did know that like Jimmy Carter was a big Dylan fan, so
right.
Seemed completely plausible to me. I literally did not think any of it was fake until I got home and like read some reviews the next day, basically. And then I watching the movie, just thinking it was completely in earnest, I made me feel one way, and then I rewatched the movie at home after knowing that, and it really does like sort of like I'm really glad I saw it before I knew that, because it really like makes you, it's like, oh man, I got tricked. It sort of like wasn't as enjoyable, but I don't know. It was like a really crazy.
It's weird because I basically couldn't avoid spoilers. I actually didn't know I needed to avoid spoilers for the documentary.
Yeah, exactly.
But I kept seeing headlines about stuff being fake, and then I was like very suspicious of everything, like to the point where I thought things were fake that weren't. I was like the whole movie just like, there's no way that's real. There's no way that's real. And like staring at every picture to see if it's been photoshopped or whatever. So it made for a certainly weird first viewing experience for me. And I kind of felt like I didn't love the movie so much. It really fails to provide you with any, and I know this is maybe like antithetical to its goals of kind of like toying with you a little bit, but there's like no historical context really provided at all. I had to like read all of this stuff. It's kind of weird. It's like there's not really a narrative. It's like kind of trying to set up like, oh, Dylan's pretty lonely or something, because like all of these, he's got all these like hangers on, like all these groupies follow him everywhere he goes and stuff. And he was trying to like sort of get like a community of friends back together or something. And yet that doesn't seem to be true at all, because then people are talking about, oh, like we never even talked to Bob Dylan. But then the whole time you're like, are they telling the truth or not? Does any of this like make you interested in watching? I will say though that like the performances, and there are many of just the whole song.
Yeah, I'm glad they did
perform. They're just like incredible, like must see. But does any of this make you more or less interested to watch it, Darren?
I don't know. I think it kind of makes me like feel a little less interested in it. I mean, I watched No Direction Home. It's been a long time, but I recall really enjoying it. And I would have imagined that this film would have been similar. Yeah. But it sounds like, and I just don't understand, like, why is there all this fake stuff in it?
I think it's almost like Take Two on Ronaldo and Clara. Did you feel that way, Dan?
Yeah, I completely do. And, everyone sort of like when it was coming, like when it first got announced, like, on a lot of the like Dylan forums and stuff I'll go on, like, people kind of were thinking like, oh, are we going to like sort of get the real Ronaldo and Clara finally,
right?
Because like Dylan tried to edit it himself. It's like 4 hours long. It's so
God.
It's actually like I've seen it a few times, and I watched it like a month ago. One, to get ready for the documentary, and because I knew we were gonna eventually do this episode, and I split it into 4 days. I watched one. Wow. I like purposely at 1 hour.
You should make it a Netflix miniseries.
No, really, because I told myself every night, just 1 hour. Don't get into it and watch two. I watched 1 hour, and it was like 1,000 times more enjoyable than any other time I've seen it, because you don't get so. There's live performances in that film, and that's like really the shining star of it, obviously. But some of the fake stuff and the acting and stuff is like kind of interesting and cool or funny, but like I don't really want to see 4 hours of kind of anything, you know what I mean? So it's like you just by the end of it, you're so like sick of it, especially because like nobody's a good actor too.
Yeah.
But
I felt a little bit the same way about the Netflix documentary, which is like,
yeah,
the best part are the performances, because like we've been talking about, like that's where the sincerity is. Like that's where the real shit is. Like him pushing himself, him chasing something, him like feeling real feelings, in these songs like Sarah and so forth, and all of the surrounding stuff, the costumes, the makeup, like the people, the talking heads in the documentary are bullshit, intentionally, but those performances are just magnetic.
Yeah, and like you said about the like, it doesn't give like really any historical context and stuff. Like obviously I went into it, I knew the context. I was a big fan. And my wife, she likes Dylan, because she has to be married to me. I mean, I'm joking. I mean, she likes him, but she doesn't. She's not going to read a book on him or doesn't care that much. And I also, my in-laws went with us, and they're they like him, but again, they're not really going to read a book on him. And my wife, like on the way home, she was like, "What was he doing when he went to talk to the guy about hurricane? Like in the the wreck?
Right.
Like,
no idea.
Yeah, like she didn't." And I was like, "Oh well, they kind of didn't play the whole thing. He's had to re-record it. All this, like I had to like at the end, I sort of had to explain the story that they. It was like when they make a movie about a book." But they don't have enough time. They have to cut stuff out. But it's well, I've read the book. I can fill you in. It sort of like felt like that a little bit, which I think was a shame, because it's such a actually like if they just told the story straight and gave you the context and everything, it's a fascinating story. I think like you wouldn't like now. I think to enjoy the movie, you have to be like a pretty big fan of Dylan. Whereas like a movie just like that was a documentary on the tour, I think like you would just have to be a fan of music to enjoy it. So it is a little disappointing, I think.
Well, that's what you missed, Darren. I would recommend, though, watching those YouTube clips I sent you of just a couple songs fully performed, because they're great. I think we're running out of time. We should move into some closing thoughts. Like I kind of mentioned, we sort of stayed, like I hoped we would, focused on like the tour as a whole. We all dabbled around through the box set and different, the bootleg series from 2002, I think, and we tried to sort of pay special attention to Montreal, December 4th, which is widely considered one of the best maybe shows that Dylan ever played, but probably the best show on this tour. Were there any just kind of like thoughts that we didn't get to? One thing that struck me is I kept feeling like Tangled Up in Blue would be an absolute heater if they like rockified it like they do in some songs on this set. And yet we get the acoustic version, and it's absolutely kind of heartbreaking the way he plays it. And I just am always amazed at how Dylan does this, like his songs in whatever permutation are kind of, that's why like they're so coverable, and there are like so many hit versions of all of his songs, and they enter like totally different contexts and styles, like R&B groups and, even like pop groups today and stuff. It's like, how they work no matter how they're played, I just can't get over that.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to his like lyric writing and everything. It's like the lyrics and the words of the song like really are what carries it, because like you said, like you can have the Byrds doing a folk rock version of it, you can have an R&B and it still works no matter what. It's a huge testament, deserves that Nobel Prize.
yeah Anything else stray thoughts jump out at you guys?
I want to say, like, we've talked about this through our whole lives. Like, I love Desire. I think that record is better than most people think it is. But the versions of the Desire songs, like during Rolling Thunder, are like next level. Like if that whole record like sort of sounded like they sound on Rolling Thunder, I think it would be
ISIS.
We
didn't shout out ISIS.
Is my favorite.
ISIS
Thunder
is fucking wild. Like, because when they
so
go
good.
into it's just like a harmonica break on the record, but like harmonica and violin, but like everybody goes nuts in like actually like the violin gets discordant, and Mick Ronson is like just shredding and like almost like a bordering on Sonic Youth territory a little bit on those like big swells. And the thing is unhinged, and I love looking at his face while he's performing.
Oh yeah,
he also looks
the movie. All the like so many close-ups like on his eyes. He's like so nuts looking.
I know.
It's great. But with the Desire stuff in the liner notes for the bootleg series, Ratso, the journalist that's in the movie and stuff, he like writes. He says that like he was on this whole tour, and that like listening to Desire, it sounds like it's like watching a movie on a well-rented like VHS tape, and then hearing the Rolling Thunder versions is HD, 1080p DVD or whatever. And that
did you kind of feel that way, Darren?
Yeah, I thought I like Desire. I really do. I like it a lot. I felt like the songs were definitely elevated here. Like I was kind of like fell in love with them again, listening to them in this sort of format. Especially like even like Hurricane, which I've heard so many times, just felt like completely new. Just the tempo was like so much faster. You know what I mean? Like they were just going like as blistering fast as you could like play that song. And I like what you guys said about ISIS. Like totally makes sense. Even One More Cup of Coffee, which really wasn't really one of my favorites, but stands out even on this record. All of the songs, honestly. I know we've talked about a lot of them. Like I thought "Blowing in the Wind" with Joan Baez was like, just hearing that song like for the first time almost. You know what I mean? Like hearing it in a totally different format, and I just
language,
really cool.
Totally different language, literally in French.
That was really that was like, super cool.
Yeah. I mean, I at the same time, I do think those songs are elevated, but at the same time, I really like how a lot of these older songs are like Desire-ified, where you've got this like Desire has this weird like I don't know, like the folk, like Roma folk music mixed with like Mexican mariachi folk music mixed with American folk and country music or something. Like I like hearing that kind of vibe, like especially on "It Ain't Me, Babe." It's got this almost like you expect like mariachi horns to come in at any moment. There's like something cool and gypsy spooky about the whole thing, and I like how the set feels quite cohesive, even though it's coming from all kinds of different eras. I mean, stuff like "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." I feel like if it just never existed and it appeared on Desire in this form, I would believe that was the original version.
Yeah, exactly. Same with like Hattie Carroll. Like it is. There's something to be said like with him using like he's basically like made a album of his material up until this point like to be played live only. It's because the set lists basically don't change much show to show, but like so he's like changed everything so much it's like making a whole new album live. It's crazy.
Well, we are going over time here. I think just to wrap it up, I just feel like this is kind of must listen stuff, and I feel like it's inspiring as a musician to listen to it. And I wonder if since Darren, you were kind of a newbie to this era like me, did you feel similarly inspired?
Most definitely. We've had a lot of discussion about the live album and the approach, and I feel like this was totally unexpected. I didn't really know what to expect to listen to a live, Dylan record. I mean, I haven't really kept up with all the bootlegs or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So this was this was pretty new to me. And, just like I mentioned, like hearing these songs I've heard hundreds of times, just played in a different way, just felt like, so inspiring. I long for so many other of my favorite bands and artists to like have done the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's like transforming like right before your eyes or before your ears or whatever. Like it's just really cool, and no one does that. I mean, I mentioned Nirvana before, like listen to those like live Nirvana albums. They're just rehashings of the same thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're fine, they're cool. It's all they have left basically of Nirvana to release. That's why we're hearing them. But I mean, it's just a band playing their songs live. It's not, a transformation like what I feel like we're hearing with Dylan.
No, I think that's completely a great point. Yeah, like things like those Nirvana live albums and most bands' live albums, they're sort of a for the fans kind of thing. Whereas like Dylan, at least maybe 66 and 75, those are like sort of must hear kind of thing. There's not too many live or too many bands that like a live album or bootlegs of live albums are must hear sort of gems.
Yeah, like just as important as any like studio album.
No, exactly.
I would argue.
Exactly. All right, well, as much as I would like to continue talking about Dylan, I guess that's enough for today. So what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on the air. You can email us popshieldpod@gmail.com. We'll have our next episode in 2 weeks. And speaking of Nirvana, that's probably what we're going to talk. So if you like the show, help us out by subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Stay connected, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that's at PopShieldPod. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.